Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us with Made to Walk. Today, we are talking about the art of crisis management advocacy. So, if you are an advocate or you are working with a nonprofit, this is going to be really helpful for you, regardless of how you engage with the general public. But this is a great first step for you to understand fully how to approach crisis management when it comes to advocacy. So, if you are new to Made to Walk, maybe you haven't heard of my ID philosophy, but it essentially stands for identify, define, discern, and decide. And we use that with everything. So, we identify what the risk is, define which category it is, discern what to do with it, and then decide to commit to do something about it. So, with that process, we're going to talk about at risk and training for dealing with at risk individuals. So, this can be really helpful when dealing with women from crisis centers, youth who are more likely to be trafficked or exploited. You may deal a lot with let's say your local CIC, you could be dealing with CPS, you could be dealing with foster care. There's a lot of different systems that deal with at risk individuals, boys that come from fatherless homes. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how to approach some of these more traumatic crisis points and what to expect in these moments, because one of the most common things that I see with advocates is they get burnt out. They get burnt out because they have an expectation of what healing looks like. And when they don't see enough movement, they feel like they're not doing enough, or the organization isn't doing enough, or they're just not seeing it happen. And so they get really discouraged and they walk away. And so I want to set some realistic expectations so that it can help advocates in the process of healing. First of all, we want to pay attention to signs and symptoms of children. So, essentially, being able to identify what are some major markers that would identify a child to be more at risk. Insecurities, life traumas. So, again, like a divorce, a recent death in the family, these kinds of things can create adverse childhood experiences that make them more susceptible to seeing some kind of more difficult crisis later in life, like abusive situations and so on and so forth. It's really unique how a predator can essentially almost like smell these things out, but they look for body language and they look for ways that they can engage and use these kinds of disadvantages to their advantage. So we want to notice them before other people notice them and be able to help them with the processes to help them and advocate for them to get the resources that they need so that they can feel more secure with themselves, try to move towards the healing that they so desperately need, or just connect them to resources that they may just not be able to have access to. You want to notice unusual privileges that are non social, economically related. So, essentially, if you see someone that maybe doesn't come from money and they start walking around with a wad of cash or a brand new Louis Vuitton, especially a young girl, those are huge red flags that usually identify something is not right. You could also look for control changes. So, new boyfriend that holds the wallet, holds the money, doesn't make them make any decisions or be alone. This is something to take note of. Now, a lot of times, unfortunately, when you have women who have entered the crisis center, they've already been going through abusive relationships and experiences, and maybe even trafficking since a very young age. And it happens right underneath our noses. And sometimes, a lot of times, people see something and they don't really know how to say something. Like, how do we deal with a situation like that? We're gonna dive into how to approach that. But first, we're just talking about what identifies someone as being at risk. And the third part of that is trauma responses occur even when the brain is confused about the trauma. So sometimes people make choices in life and they think that that's a valid choice, and it can cause trauma. Sometimes they go through something and they tell themselves they're fine. They wake up 5 years from then and they realize they never dealt with some kind of traumatic experience. So, not all trauma looks and sounds like you may think. Oh, well, it's like in the movies, some like there's a death and there's like immediate emotional response. It doesn't always work like that. It can be in all different kinds of phases and points. We'll talk about that here in just a second, but can also look and sound very different than what you may be expecting. So, unfortunately, these kinds of traumas, these kinds of symptoms that create at risk scenarios are perfect for someone who is out there grooming ways to use that, manipulate them to their advantage. So, this is a formula that has essentially been processed through ABA, which is applied behavior, and is used very commonly with children. Identifying behaviors doesn't matter if you are a small child all the way to, later in life when you're approaching the end of your life. Every single one of your behaviors identifies you into one of these categories. You are trying to escape something, have access to something, have attention, have some kind of sensory, um, just be able to connect with some sensory, have some formulation of control or counter control. And so, um, when we can identify what does this child need and get ahead of it, we are doing great. I think ABA work is beautiful. I think that they do a great job. Communication and ABA work go hand in hand because sometimes we see a behavior and that behavior is communicating to us a trauma, but it may be communicating to a behavior analyst as a behavior that they need to correct. And so we need to identify which category it falls under. Is this a behavior that we need to correct, or is this a temporary behavior as a sign and symptom of a traumatic incident? So there's not always like a cut and dry black and white version to how to approach these things, but they work hand in hand, which is why we use this as a tool. It's not the tool, it's not the only tool, but it is a tool. So being able to meet with a client. So say example, you are a youth minister or a pastor and you are dealing with a high risk situation or an at risk situation, you may want to ask yourself, what does this behavior telling us? It's going to fall into one of these categories. So I'll give you an example. A young child who has screaming tantrums off the top of his throat in the middle of a grocery store. He just is flailing. I want to go. I want to go. I don't want to be here. I want to go. And eventually wears mom down enough to where she's like, oh my gosh, this is so miserable. She picks up the child. She leaves the grocery store and she's like, I'll do this later. Well, every single time she goes to the grocery store, she can't figure out why he keeps screaming and flailing. Well, because essentially you've told him that if he screams and he flails loud enough and long enough, he will be able to escape being at the thing he doesn't want to be at. So, sometimes it's access, same scenario, but the mom, instead of leaving, says, if you be quiet, I'll give you a sucker. And then she wonders why she has to give the child a sucker every time they go into the grocery store because you've given him access to something he wanted. And so if I kick and I scream loud enough, mom will give me a sucker. So we have to identify what are some of these behaviors that an at-risk individual is looking to achieve by doing these things. And sometimes they mean different things. Like I said here just a moment ago in my example, this screaming, the kicking and the screaming for two different children were two different behaviors looking to achieve two different things. One was trying to escape the situation. One just wanted access to a lollipop. He was perfectly fine staying in the grocery store as long as he could have a lollipop. So we have to be able to identify what is this kid trying to achieve with this action, with this behavior, or this person, this adult, this behavior that is infiltrating our churches. Sometimes we deal with I call it an addiction to empathy. There can be many different trauma responses that can occur. And so you have to kind of be able to identify them before you can know how to approach them. Okay, so we identify what the issue is, and we are assessing and defining which category it comes from. Now we're going to talk about extraction. How do we start to open up the conversation and be able to work towards being effective and efficient in our discernment of what to do next? And so discerning is very sensitive because we need to be very conscientious of how we extract information and how we extract people from difficult situations. Um, I use this example pretty much with everything because it works for everything. You have two frogs, one in a pot of boiling hot water, one in a room temperature water that you slowly bring up to a boiling point. The one in the blazing hot water is going to jump right out, but the one in the lukewarm water will eventually boil to death because it doesn't know that it's turning up. Now, this works with people who are grooming, like I talked about in just the earlier slide. When we can identify what the at risk situation is, someone else can identify it. So a predator is going to use that to lure someone in. And just like I give this example, it takes 9 months for your body to prepare for a baby to be born and 9 months for your body to go back to where it was. If someone is in the process of a bad behavior, don't think that a quick reaction is going to be the solution. You're going to be the boiling hot water. They're going to jump right out of that pot and they're going to run back to the abusive situation that they're in or the high risk, at risk situation that they're in. So we need to be very conscientious of the fact that groomers are working to pull them in. We need to be working slowly to extract them out. And that is a process of being very patient. And it looks like this. Be safety for those willing to speak. So we need to learn how to be listeners first. I teach this in crisis centers, and it's very easy as a volunteer to want to share experiences, right? So they want to have this ebb and flow of conversation. They want to show that they are here to be loving and empathetic and all of the things. And unfortunately, your life experiences may not be their life experiences. And so they may express this job they had one time and they had to work outside and it was so hot and it was so unbearable and it was so uncomfortable and they're so glad they're not at that job anymore. And someone goes, "Oh, I know. The last time I was in Florida, I got burnt to a crisp being on the beach." Well, it may feel like a relation, like you're trying to relate to their situation, but it's not quite hitting the point. You're not quite on the same level. And so it can come off um, almost very selfish for you to turn the conversation towards yourself, even though that's not the intent. And it really is an organic thing to try to ebb and flow in conversation. But when we're trying to do extraction, we're there just to listen. We're really not there to give our life experiences. I often say if you have someone that wants to be an advocate and they start the conversation off with, "Well, I really want to help with sexual assault victims because I was sexually abused or I was raped or I went through something very traumatic." I say immediately that person is not ready to be an advocate. They'll say to me, "Why?" Well, they can share their experiences. I'm like, that's exactly the problem. Why? They haven't fully dealt with their experience and they're going to be talking more about their experience and saying, well, when it happened to me, well, when I happened to go through this or in my experience, and they're going to devalue the other person trying to share their story. So we need to be very conscientious of the advocates that we choose because they need to be fully healed. And I know that that can be a really difficult process to assess. How do you know? Well, do they start off by telling you their trauma, by trauma vomiting, or are they able to assess what the needs are of the individual and the stages that they'll go through and the process and the long-term goal? And then you realize, okay, that person's already been through that. That's why they can speak to it because they've been through it. That's very good. I like that. I like that they're on the other side of it and they can speak to that. You only want to respond to what is spoken. So if someone starts talking about something and it's really important to them, even though it may feel completely off topic, and I find this to be something very, very common. So I'll give you an example. Let's just say a woman is sitting down at a crisis center and she's eating a piece of pizza and she is just going on about how amazing this piece of pizza is. And she just couldn't be happier to be eating pizza. And immediately the advocate feels like she's not doing her job because they're not talking about her crisis. They're not talking about her drama. They're not talking about her experience. And so she'll try to move the conversation into something deeper. And what she doesn't understand is that it very well may be that especially dealing with traffic victims, which is mainly what we write these these slides for when we're training about is that when someone is in sex trafficking, their entire food system is under control. They can't decide what to purchase, what to eat, when to eat, if they can eat. So the idea that they get to decide to eat a piece of pizza, and maybe the person that was trafficking them hated pizza, so they haven't seen pizza in 5 years. This is a huge milestone for them. This is a huge just moment to be celebrated. And the advocate's going to feel like, "Oh, I don't feel like I'm doing anything here," but you are. You're sitting with them in their experience, and their experience is that they get to eat pizza today. And that is a huge achievement for them. So, don't always just cut yourself short by thinking, "I'm not doing anything here and I'm not making an impact." These little baby steps are huge wins. Speak only among staff when necessary to crisis planning. So, what this is pertaining to is if you see a red flag, if you are working specifically in this field and you see a red flag, the last thing you do is cause panic. And the last thing that you do is talk about someone in front of other people. They can sit there and go, "Oh, they're over there talking about Ashley, and Ashley's going through this and blah 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 blah," and then all of a sudden it starts going around the room because you were not discreet enough to have that conversation separately. Also, be very conscientious of what you put in writing, what you disclose, and if you are doing anything that would have any kind of HIPAA violation, that you make sure that you are training on what that procedure is and what all of those necessary protocols would need to be. Anger. Scripting is very common. It is a very real thing, especially when people have gone through multiple crises, or they have been in crisis their whole life, or just never have been given the opportunity to actually deal with their crisis. And what it looks like is, "Hi, my name is da 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 da. This is what happened to me as a kid." And for most people, they kind of react like, "I don't know what to do with all of that. That's a lot, and I'm not equipped to handle any of that." And so they kind of like freak out, and they're like, "Oh, okay, well, let's step out in the hall so other people can't hear what you're saying." So they kind of try to brush it under the rug. This scripting is something that um, anyone that's gone through a crisis does to test your reaction. Like, do you really care about me enough to be uncomfortable when I tell you what I've gone through? Or are you going to treat me like a damaged little person? Are you going to be condescending towards me? Are you going to walk away? Are you too scared to have this conversation? They're a lot tougher than you think that they are. Rage is also something that is very common amongst people who are dealing with some kind of trauma, or in some kind of crises. You may see one have a burst of rage out of nowhere, even in the midst of a tragedy. And that is because rage is not in the anger family, it is in the anxiety family. So those bouts of uncontrollable rage, they are coming from anxiety. They may be a source of PTSD. They may be a symptom of some other kind of trauma that they've gone through. Again, dealing with trafficking victims, often you may find that these women are forced to have abortions. They are forced to do many things that they don't want to do. But sometimes dealing with just post-abortion syndrome, which is the same DSM-5 rating as PTSD. So it's really like having layers and layers and layers of PTSD. It's not just PTSD. It is not PTSD from one thing they've experienced. It's multiple things. So again, it's like peeling back an onion very gently and very slowly. You may get through one traumatic crisis and feel like you've achieved something and you've moved past, and then it just opens the door for something else they haven't quite touched on yet. So just be patient. Secondary trauma can cause bouts of rage, so be careful with it within your advocates or in yourself, because dealing with crisis situations often can definitely develop secondary trauma within you. It can be very dangerous for you to harm others emotionally because you're not self-checking yourself and saying, okay, like I'm overextended. I need a mental health break. I need to be able to assess how to bring myself down. Today was a very traumatic day, depending on what the circumstance was, what you had to witness or see or explain. These kinds of things definitely can cause secondary trauma. So always keep that in mind. In the back of my workbook, if you've ordered it, is a secondary trauma page that's very helpful in processing how to help families as well. So one child may have gone through something or a parent may have gone through something. You need to be doing the secondary trauma check with every single solitary family member in that household. It doesn't matter if they are 5, 15, or 55. It's very possible that they could show some symptoms at some point. Number 3 is healing is a time commitment, not a stage. So denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are all part of the process. And sometimes they ping pong back and forth. So they may express anger and then depression and then come back to bargaining and then go back to depression. It may be a few cycles around and around until they hit acceptance. And again, it is not a race to the finish line. It is about getting to the finish line in one piece. So we train for a sprint, even though it's just a sprint and it's from point A to point B, you still do a lot of training to get from point A to point B in a certain amount of time. You kind of have to think of it like that. You may see the goal, and the goal may be very visible and reachable to you, but they are doing some training within themselves to build up the courage to make that sprint. So just give them some time. Remember that safe to you may not be safe for them. So you may make a suggestion to work with an individual, to go to a particular crisis center, to go to a particular nonprofit, to have a resource, to even think to yourself at times, why don't you just go home? Why don't you just go live with your mom? Well, maybe mom was very abusive. Maybe there's a lot of childhood trauma there at home. Maybe they experienced something with a step parent or a parent. So never assume that what seems simple, a simple solution to you because you had a positive experience, can be a simple solution for them. And things that you may think are very traumatic may not be traumatic to them. So try to do your best to compartmentalize your experiences from theirs. So here is a list of takeaways that you can ponder on. Watch your response, tone, and sincerity. It's really important that we are not sitting there looking at our watch, looking at our phone, going, yeah, okay. I've heard this story 5 times. You want to be attentive. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they may have to tell a story 4, 5, 6 times. And it's just the bravery of being able to say it out loud. Just let them process through that. Don't make the predator a bad guy. I know that seems so counterproductive, but it actually is absolutely non-effective. So a person may come to a crisis center or be going through a trauma. They haven't defined that person as a bad person yet. There could be a lot of grooming involved. There could be a lot of love bombing involved. So they may know that it was bad enough that they had to leave or say something, but they're not sure if it was so bad that they won't go back. So be very careful because they have to come to that understanding on their own. You have to help them to show them what a positive relationship looks like, what a positive atmosphere looks like. And when they see healthy and safe and positive, and they remember what it was like in that home, or they remember what it was like with that particular person, they will go, oh, yeah, okay, I don't want to go back. I can't go back because now that I know what it's like on the other side. But if you immediately start attacking, they're going to feel very defensive, shut down, closed off, and they're not going to enjoy their environment. They're going to try to think of ways to get out and go back to where they came from. Need to have access to communication or a tip line is something that is separate from talking to someone face to face. Look, not everybody is a talker. Not everyone is a sharer. Not everyone wants everyone knowing their business, but they do sometimes have to ask solid questions. And sometimes they're embarrassed by those questions. So just create some kind of transparency to where everyone knows this is a way that you can communicate with us outside of just approaching someone. Observe anxiety around media access. So if you start to see that they're fidgeting, protecting their phone, checking it super often, scared to set it down, they may be still controlled by an individual through the other side of the phone. Even if they've physically left a situation, they're still being controlled. So you need to very, very slowly work your way to encouraging them to distance themselves from the phone and to give them more time to think about the difference of the two situations and to be able to hear the sound of their own thoughts and their own needs as opposed to someone else telling them what to do. In closing here, just reminding what advocacy truly can make an impact with is, never make decisions in times of grief. As an advocate, you should be emphasizing this. If they've just gone through something horrific, remind them not to sign anything, not to have any legal meetings, nothing to that regard until they can come down from a stage of fight or flight. People look for someone to follow. So make sure that you're setting good examples, because they may very well look to you as, you are someone I'm looking to mirror. You are someone I'm looking for positive behaviors from. So set those positive behavior standards. Never advise on a field unrelated to your expertise. So if you are not an expert in a particular field, please don't give advice. um, be along with them in the process, but don't willingly give legal advice or anything to that regard. You can help in the advocacy by saying, these are some things you can expect. But what you don't say is, oh, you're going to want to do this. You're going to say, these are some things that you can do to help yourself get prepared for the process before you go and meet with your attorney. Things to that regard. Patience and commitment. It's just standard. You got to have it. Guiding versus expectations. We want to guide people through the processes and not expect them to be at any one stage or expect them to have gotten to any one particular point at any one particular time. This really helps yourself be able to stay in the game longer because you're not being disappointed, and it also helps them for not feeling the pressure, that they're letting you down, that you expect more and they can't do it, and then they give up and they feel like a failure and they run back to the world in which they left. Positive behavior reinforcement. So if you're dealing with single moms, emphasize the positive things. Maybe they came from really bad homes or their moms used to traffic them out. And so unfortunately, or their moms were drug addicts, they're trying to get out of that life. When you see a mom sitting down having dinner with the other moms and the other kids, and she reaches over and she wipes the food off her little one's face, you just lean over and say, you're such a good mama. You're such a good mama. You're doing so great. That baby is so blessed to have you. And that encourages them to do the positive behavior things. That makes them want to feel like, I want to be a good mom for my kids. So those things really help to set the tone. I'm going to close here with this. Titus chapter 3, verses 3 through 8. At one time, we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. But when the kindness of love and love of God, our Savior, appeared, He saved us, not because of righteousness, things that we had done, but because of His mercy. He saved us through the washing of the rebirth and renewal by the Holy Spirit, whom He poured out on us generously through Christ Jesus, our Savior, so that having been justified by His grace, we might become heirs, having the hope of eternal life. This is a trustworthy saying, and I want you to stress these things so that those who have trusted in God may be careful to devote themselves to doing what is good. These things are excellent and profitable for everyone. And I love these verses so much because it gives you a heart checkpoint. If this is not how you are thinking about the people you are serving, if this is not how you are feeling towards them, you need to take a pause. You need to walk away for a little bit, take a refresher, maybe come back, or maybe move to a different area. Maybe it's just time to step back from that because it can make you jaded. It can make you exhausted. It can make you discouraged and it can make you resentful. Some people, they just will take advantage and they can hurt you along in the process. And if you feel like you can't look at them with the kind of conceptual idea that they are are heirs to God's throne, and they are in a process, and you are there to be alongside them in that process. Just take that breath. Just take that moment. It is okay. I would much rather someone walk away from the work and refresh and renew and come back whole than to do the work in vain and to hurt others with our emotional experiences. So I hope that this has been helpful to you as an advocate, or if you're thinking about getting into advocacy, this is a great starting point for you. I hope to do more, and I thank you guys so much for continuing to watch and tune in.